We all should think through what are the pieces of the Endangered Species Act that work well and that don't feel like they're penalizing landowners, and then those places where we feel like it's penalizing. And I think there's this whole piece of it that's not regulatory, that we do so much work to not have to get to listing species.
Welcome to the On Land Podcast. This is Louis Wirtz, Editor-in-Chief of On Land. This week on the podcast, we are excited to bring you a conversation with someone shaping the future of Western working lands and wildlife. Someone every landowner should know, Martha Williams. Williams is the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the agency responsible for implementing the Endangered Species Act. 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the ESA, so it is the perfect time to check in with Williams about the Act's shortcomings, successes, and future outlook. Williams grew up on a farm in Maryland and studied law at the University of Montana. Before becoming director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, she was the director of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks from 2017 to 2020. Williams spoke with Lesli Allison, CEO of Western Landowners Alliance, in August at Granger Ranches in the Madison Valley of Montana. Their conversation took place after meeting with landowners and touring the ranch's remarkable stream restoration project. Let's jump right in with Lesli and Martha now.
Martha, I am so excited to have you here today to join us for this interview. Thank you very much for being here.
I am so excited to be here and to be having this conversation with you, Lesli.
Well, terrific. You know, we've had such a good partnership with the service over the years. I feel like we're making great progress. I think there's a lot that we can be hopeful about looking forward.
I couldn't agree more that there's a lot to be hopeful for, but I'm also really pleased to hear we're on a good trajectory in your work with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
We are, absolutely. So the Endangered Species Act, let's start with this. The Endangered Species Act is turning 50 this year.
It is.
And looking back, how effective do you think it has been in conserving and recovering species?
I always wonder if that's a loaded question or not. But no, no, I think that, you know, in totality, it's been incredible. It's been remarkable to have a law like this that's been around for 50 years. And if you think about other laws, the Endangered Species Act really hasn't been amended very often. You know, are there things that we've learned? Absolutely. But if you think about the way in which over 99% of the species that were ever listed are still around, they haven't blinked out, I think the attention that it's brought to conservation and ecosystems and the wildlife that I think we care about so much in this country.
So it passed in 1973 in a landslide bipartisan vote, and it was signed by a Republican president. How is it that it's become so polarizing and so politicized today? What changed?
Excellent question, and I wish I had a really good answer to it. I'd love to ask that right back to you, Lesli. I think first off, it was almost unanimous and that it did pass in a Republican, the Nixon administration is amazing. But I think also to remember why it passed. So it passed in a bipartisan fashion. It came about at a time where we were losing species and we weren't thinking through our activities as humans and the impact on the environment around us. The American public said, let's think about doing this in a new way. It's good for people. It's good for species. That's what I think the thinking was at the time.
That's actually a good segue back to your question about what has happened. I think that from the landowner side of things, the one real challenge has been that the ESA can be seen as inadvertently penalizing the people who are doing the most for conservation. And so many landowners value and enjoy wildlife very much. They want to be part of the solution. They don't want to see species going extinct on their watch, on their land. And yet they also fear that having an endangered species on their property or on their public grazing allotment could put them out of business. So I guess my question now back to you is that fear justified? And how do we think about that?
I think I'd like to unpackage that a little bit, Lesli, because what I want to recognize that landowners are so important. Working lands are really important to community fabric, are essential to almost all species survival. And so it is a partnership that goes hand in hand. And so to think about the beginning of your question and then maybe what's gone wrong, I feel like, as I've traveled around talking to landowners, by and large, they remain in awe and curious about these species just like the rest of us, if not more so. And so I think about going to the Rocky Mountain front when we were really first starting to have conflicts with grizzly bears there. Talking to a landowner who was worried about grizzly bears, who was really more worried about elk eating his hay, but he took me aside away from everyone else and said, "Hey, come look at this. I have this photo of a sow with 3 cubs. Like, can you believe this?"
Oh, that's great.
And I don't think that that's that unusual. It was a wonderful moment, but I think that's very common. We all should think through what are the pieces of the Endangered Species Act that work well and that don't feel like they're penalizing landowners, and then those places where we feel like it's penalizing. And I think there's this whole piece of it that's not regulatory, that we do so much work to not have to get to listing species. And so to remember that piece and landowners' roles in keeping species off the need to list.
I think that's right. I think we have a consensus among stakeholders that that's what we need to be doing. We need to be getting out of that emergency room approach to wildlife management by implementing proactive voluntary conservation measures and avoiding that need to list species in the first place. How do we get there?
I think we would all rather be in the space of the voluntary conservation and the partnerships that are needed to make that so effective. I do believe there is a place for the Endangered Species Act too when that doesn't work. One of the problems with the Endangered Species Act right now is there seems to be the incredible on-the-ground work, and then there's the political rhetoric, or the rhetoric and singular focus on whether a species is listed or whether it's delisted. And the reality that we all know is that species go through this whole continuum of recovery, of being in trouble, at risk, recovering, maybe slipping back, maybe recovering again. And that we're all talking about the long-term viability, survival of the species in much more than 4-year increments, etc. So I do think one of the real problems has been this kind of hyper focus on, is a species listed or not? The fight is about listing and delisting. It's the wrong question. Instead of saying, what should we all be doing together to make sure this species stays on the landscape and we allow people to live within their communities, make a living, stay on the land, and support the ecosystem functions. I want to be careful to say I don't discount the fear. I want to hear it and I want to learn from it and I want us to be able to address it. But I also think there's so many projects where when the work is developed with a community, it is less vulnerable, less susceptible to that kind of litigation.
I completely agree with you. I think that collaborative conservation really lays a path for better outcomes for everyone. As long as we've got all the stakeholders at the table, that works well.
Yes.
We do have that challenge of those groups that are not participating in that process. That brings us to this other question that you often hear, again, back to this theme from landowners with respect to the ESA, that no good deed goes unpunished. And that's because, as you know, landowners who volunteer to conserve and recover species can be those that are at greatest risk of increased regulatory intervention and environmental litigation. And regulatory assurance agreements, such as the Candidate Conservation Agreement with assurances and safe harbor agreements, were really designed to address this. However, these agreements are relatively little known within the landowner community, and they're often very difficult for individual landowners to access. How can we change this? How can we make it better, easier for a landowner to be assured?
That's a great question. And how do we allow landowners to know that we are there to help There are tools available. How do we make those tools more readily available? And how do we, for example, I think where candidate conservation agreements with assurances or safe harbor agreements have been successful, for example, in the Big Hole Valley, is where we pull landowners in together into common agreements or umbrella agreements. It makes it not as hard to enter into them. It's the Fish and Wildlife Service's intent. We would much rather enter those agreements and prevent the need to list a species. We're not in this wanting to list species. We want to see them conserved into the future. And so where we can make those agreements more accessible, where we can help support them, that's something for us to talk about.
When we were involved with the Western Governors Association 3-year Endangered Species Initiative, that was the consensus of all the stakeholders, very diverse stakeholders across the West, livestock groups, environmental groups, everyone agreed we need to get ahead of the curve, support landowners in proactive voluntary conservation and recovery.
Yes.
These regulatory assurance agreements are a really key piece of that. And there are still some barriers, and one of those barriers is funding. There's not a long-term source of funding for a party, whether that's the agency, whether that's a state wildlife agency or a nonprofit organization, to develop those agreements and then administer those agreements over time, because they're long-term commitments at 20 to 50 years, and it's very difficult to get that kind of appropriation, for example. So I think that's one of the places that we'd love to see some more work and some political will, because that's a very, honestly, a low-hanging fruit, and they're not very expensive.
Yes.
That's an opportunity for us to take this unintended disincentive out of the Endangered Species Act and be able to make it really positive for everybody when species get conserved and recovered.
I would agree, Leslie, that there's a lot of opportunity there. If we had the funding, a lot more proactive work. We could do a lot more proactive work because I think many landowners want that. I think it's one of the reasons why there's such interest in the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, to help the states with funding so that species don't get to the point of needing to be listed.
There's really some exciting movement that we've been watching for a while within the Fish and Wildlife Service. People are talking about it as conservation without conflict. Mm-hmm. And we've seen some great successes in the Southeast and other parts of the country. Can you explain a little bit about what this is and how it came about?
You have been helping, and it's been fun to see it blossom more as more regions and people understand the concept and the opportunity. And that's where, if we all work together to help prevent human-wildlife conflicts, the tolerance on the landscape, the impact to people's livelihoods, lives, community safety, when we can be more proactive and be thinking about and asking, what do you need? What does your community need? How do we help you achieve what you want to achieve and build that together? But I think it's been a shift where we're not so full of ourselves, where we're a bit more humble and we show up and ask, what do you need? How do we meet you where you are? And we're in this for the long term.
Absolutely. If you want to see people be really happy, just go out onto a project where you've got a landowner that's been working with the service and other partners and is bringing back these species. It's exciting.
Yes.
It's exciting to see those black-footed ferrets out there, right?
Right.
It's exciting to see the little frogs coming back in these, precious little ponds out in the desert.
Or beetles, or seeing salmon return where they haven't been in 100 years, or even a landowner who has just used prescribed burns for longleaf pine restoration, and they're plants that haven't been there for 100 years, that they're still there in the soil and they come back when we give them that chance.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Amazing.
And it's something, if we can recognize that that's happening, we can celebrate it together. We can celebrate the role of the landowners. We can celebrate the role of the service as a partner, as a true partner in conservation. That's really a recipe for hope.
I agree with you, but I think also to take that on ourselves and be better storytellers and not be scared about talking about how it impacts our hearts and minds, and it gets to our happiness as a species and our survival as a species.
Many landowners have expressed a preference for a multi-species habitat-based approach to wildlife conservation because as land managers, we manage whole pieces of ground for many different values. And yet some species have very specific needs that need to be satisfied in order to reproduce or survive, for example. In some cases, the needs of one species, though, can conflict with the needs of another species on the same landscape. So how is the Fish and Wildlife Service thinking about this question of habitat-based conservation versus single-species conservation at this point?
That is one area where I think the Endangered Species Act has been tough. I can think of an example of what we're doing with our fish passage work, where we got an infusion from the bipartisan infrastructure law, an infusion in investment in removing fish barriers across the country. We are now working with all of our partners and all of the different federal agencies to coordinate, to better sequence the projects, to know what one project is in a watershed versus another and how they fit together so that we have fewer of those species by species conflicts. So that's where I see the most hope is in us coordinating those efforts and then showing the difference that that makes. But that doesn't mean we don't have work to do on the singular species as well.
That brings me to this question, which is that the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program has been consistently popular with landowners for a very long time.
Yeah.
Can you explain the program and why you think that one has been so successful?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I fell in love with the Partners program well before I worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service because I saw their positive impact in bringing a community together and then helping the landscape too. So an example would be the Blackfoot Valley, where the Partners program really helped show up with others to say, what do you want envision? What do you want to see in this valley? And how do we bring all of our different pieces to bear to help build that? At an early age, I just saw the positive impact of that type of coordination, community work. I'd say another piece of the Partners program that's really important is that typically our partners, Fish and Wildlife Service partners, employees, are part of the community, right? So they build trust. Hopefully, you're right, they build trust within that community and then are also there to listen and see and adjust as needed. So I think it's that human element that the Partners program brought in, and it was a different approach that was less, you shall do this, and more, what do you want to see and how do we help you get there?
Well, I would agree with you actually there. I think we have common ground. I think most people recognize the need for the law, the good intent of the law, and that on the whole, there's many good things that have come out of it. I think that it is the challenge, but I think it's a challenge we can overcome. So it's how do we implement the Endangered Species Act? It's not whether we should throw it out. I'll close with this one last question, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing to improve the Endangered Species Act implementation or outcomes over the next 50 years, what would it be?
I think about that question all the time, Leslie. And I think of the Endangered Species Act at 50 and that it's so important because it's all about saving life on Earth. I think we get there by realizing that the way nature works is really important. And how do we support people taking care of those processes that turn out to be very important for fire, drought, flood, food security, physical security, our well-being. We have the Endangered Species Act because there was that collective effort in this country to say, we see what we've done, we don't want to continue this, and we choose as a culture to take the costs on. Has it borne out differently? To some degree, yes. There is a constant tension where the species exist, and for those who don't live there may never see that species, but they want to know that that species isn't going to blink out because it might be tied to like biomedical research. We don't know what we might learn from those species I don't know how to resolve that tension. I think it's a fair one, and I hear it and I've seen it living in the West. But I also think there are those who just want to know these species aren't going to blink out.
The On Land podcast is a production of the Western Landowners Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded and led by landowners. We are committed to sustaining working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Half of all the land and most of the best habitat in the West is privately owned. So if you care about the future of the American West, now's the time to get to know the Alliance and support private land stewardship. Learn more and join us at westernlandowners.org.
Hey, Lewis Wirtz, Editor-in-Chief of On Land here. Thanks again to Martha Williams and the press folks at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for allowing her to join us. Stay tuned to the pod feed for more content on the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, and check out onland.westernlandowners.org for show notes, plus original photos and more stories about conservation of biodiversity on private and working lands. We'll see you next time.